Brack's Collins Street, 5 p.m. references Gentleman Bellini's procession from 1496 and draws an analogy between Venice and Melbourne, European art and Australian art, old and new, and participates in the construction of an Australian identity indelibly linked, though in reaction to and possibly in decline from its European traditions. Unlike O'Brien, Brack remains consciously and overtly Australian. The title of his painting is an urban landscape, unambiguously announcing itself as Melbourne. In the prescribed, homogeneous and rigid society depicted in Brack's Collins Street, there was no place for individualism. For O'Brien, leaving Australia was an opportunity for exploration, not only of other regions, but also of the self and of other possibilities in art. The changes wrought by his travels are apparent in the shift in his work from the literal, as seen in his early portraits, to the use of symbolism inspired by the revival of antiquity. This is a self-portrait painted in 1939. He painted it before he left Australia for the first time. Here O'Brien portrays himself as an artist, consciously working within a recognizable historical tradition. The young artist stares hesitantly out to one side, avoiding the direct gaze of the viewer, telling very little about himself. There is no tension, no element of indeterminacy or conflict. It is a literal portrayal painted in a traditional style, reminiscent of Velázquez. Compare this to his self-portrait painted in 1941 during an internment in Poland and after his experiences of wartime lives in Greece. The warmth of the first portrait, with its smooth tonality and fine brushwork, has been replaced by a self-conscious use of paint and jarring colour. The background is lightened into a muddy mass, which is reflected in the sallow tone of the once youthful, rounded cheek. His eyes no longer look hesitantly out of the canvas, but seem to challenge the viewer into an awareness, revealing a modernist agonism and pain. And the elongated features and dark outlines owe a debt to Pugliani. In this self-portrait, we see him beginning to convey spiritual states through colour and form, which will find resolution in the symbolism and brilliant colour of his religious-themed works. Upon release from service in 1944, O'Brien exhibited this and other portraits in one of the first POW artist exhibitions in Sydney. What was shown was different to the work of any other Australian war artist. Instead of depicting the realities of war or prison camp life, which could serve to glorify the role of Australian soldiers and contribute to the Australian mythology, O'Brien's portraits portray an inner world and demonstrate an intellectual engagement with painting itself. Evident in these works is a search for an alternative language through which to make sense of his individual wartime experiences, rather than a conscious contribution to a national identity. He began to explore the use of religious subjects, and particularly Christian narratives, which allowed a thematic freedom otherwise denied by literal representation. The use of religious symbolism was also perhaps a form of closeting his nonconformist sexuality. O'Brien returned to Europe in 1947 and saw, amongst other works, the Piero della Francesca paintings, held at the gallery in London, as well as Duccio frescoes in Siena. He was particularly impressed by Duccio, an encounter he refers to as his first proper aesthetic experience, the first time I really felt design in colours. The ideology of progress as laid out by Vasari was overturned by O'Brien, conflating Duccio and Piero, and at the same time alluding to modernist painters. The negation of the temporal discrepancy denies the art historical reference and demonstrates a modernist self-reflexivity in his art, a theme I'd like to explore further in the works of other artists. On his return to Sydney, O'Brien entered and won the inaugural Blake Prize with his triptych The Virgin Enthroned, inspired by Piero and Duccio's Maesta. The Blake Prize for Contemporary Religious Work was established in Sydney in 1951, influenced, according to Humphrey McQueen, by a European movement for the renewal of sacred art. However, Bernard Smith saw art practice and the renewal of interest in religion in Australia at the time as a foil against the uncertainties of modern life, which included for him the nuclear arms race, mass communication, and communism. I found out that there was quite a debate at the time surrounding art prizes in Sydney and Melbourne, with some suggesting that these competitions, because the art community was so small, had replaced rigorous criticism, and that's also something that I'd like to examine in the future. For Justin O'Brien, raised on Catholicism and now seeking a symbolic framework, the work of Duccio and Piero provided an avenue of articulation through a combination of religious iconography, the simplicity and structure of formalism, and the experimental use of colour. Rather than a retreat into the practice of art suggested by Smith, O'Brien used religious imagery and its universal themes of death and reawakening as a means of concealment, not only of his sexuality and wartime trauma, but also of an overtly Australian identity. The bright colours, the hierarchically arranged figures, and the tight linear articulation of forms all pay homage to the Italian primitives in a way that at the time perhaps constituted an international currency and denied Australian specificity. O'Brien divided his canvas into three, the triptych formally acknowledging the debt to Duccio and announcing the spiritual basis of the work, as well as the potential use of art as a carrier of spiritual value. The use of the triptych has precedence in Australian mythology, as we saw earlier today. And that one. McCubbin's iconic triptych, The Pioneer, attaches a spiritual reverence to the early settlers and their battle with the harsh and hostile land. Unlike McCubbin's realistic portrayal of the landscape, O'Brien's landscape is symbolic and ambiguous. He could be portrayed Elizabeth Bay in Sydney, where he spent his childhood, or it could be the Tuscan hills surrounding Siena or Arezzo. The brightness of the colours yield to the quiet stillness of the grave and simply moulded figures, which, like Piero's, stand in monumental silence. The narrative evolves only through the slightest of gestures, and the symbolism suggested by the sailboat, the white dove, and the banksia offer up the possibility of a meaning beyond the aesthetic. As in Piero's work, the absence of expressed emotion allows an appreciation of the aesthetic qualities, only the colours suggesting the celebration of the event taking place. The walled fortress-like buildings balanced precariously on hilltops and cliff faces are a quotation from Sienese art, seen for example in the landscapes of Giovanni Lepparo or Sassetta. The bright pinks, blues and reds, inspired by Duccio, are indicative of a subjective interpretation of images felt rather than seen. The green face and hands of the Virgin reference the green underpaint of medieval Madonnas exposed through time and now made modern by O'Brien. An interesting gesture to the timelessness of art and connections with the past. The impossible landscape, stylized trees, angels and quiet interaction between the figures suggest an idealized vision of an ordered world. If the paintings of Siena echo the politics of the time, O'Brien's painting looks to the past in order to articulate the present. The use of colour, freed from naturalistic constraints, renders the landscape far removed from McCubbin's realism. Yet the placement of the banksia in the left-hand panel goes some way to relieving its ambiguity. Flowers were used symbolically in art as a means of communication in the Trecento, and the placement of the banksia is a self-conscious and subtle reference to an Australian identity, in contrast with McCubbin's overtly nationalistic narrative. O'Brien's work is about the power of colour and the simplicity of form, its self-consciousness authenticating his own cultural self-consciousness. It demonstrates the transcendence of time and place, which perhaps denies a separate Australian aesthetic through the ubiquitousness of Christian art and the possibility of the same religious truths applying in both Siena and Australia. In this way, O'Brien collapses the difference between Australia and Europe into a kind of universal overarching truth, incorporating the two cultures. In contrast, Bright uses the past to critique Australian culture, while McCubbin romanticizes it. Justin O'Brien rejected the mythologizing of Australia using literal representations of interactions with the land, a land for him both hostile and strange. Barry Pearce quotes him as saying, "I don't want to paint the Australian landscape. I can't tell you how lonely it makes me feel." Instead, through the idealization of European culture, he challenged Smith's model of an Australian art tradition by negating any social or physical interaction with the environment. By locating himself outside of this tradition, O'Brien was able to propose an unemotional and symbolic alternative to the contemporary Australian discourse, a quiet discussion rather than an